Hello, hi. Can we hear me? Am I okay? Not good enough? What did I do?
This is only recording.
Oh, okay, never mind. So then I'll speak loudly then. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Jose Diaz. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself that wasn't in there, I have a history based in teaching middle school, so if I treat you like middle schoolers, it's not to insult you, it's just that I'm used to being a little bit ridiculous in front of a group of people, so I apologize if that is unprofessional for you. But anyway, we're going to talk about acculturation, sexual minority stress, and HIV-related risk behavior among Latino minority sex men in New York City. So one of the first questions I get when I talk about this research is, why would I focus on this subpopulation in particular? So when we look at historic, oh great, my slides are not going to line up perfectly. Cool. So when we look at the historic information about new HIV diagnoses, back in 2015, what we saw is that Black MSM, the largest number of new diagnoses were among Black MSM, then white MSM, then Hispanic and Latino MSM. And when we look at 2017, we actually see that Hispanic and Latino MSM are responsible for more, or at least male-to-male sexual contact among that population is responsible for more new diagnoses annually. And what we've actually seen is if you look at the five-ish year trends that they typically release when they release this data, I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's between 2011 and 2015. What we've seen is that the number of new diagnoses among Black MSM or attributed to male-to-male sexual contact in that population has remained roughly the same. And in white male-to-male sexual contact, I'm going to go back and be a little bit obnoxious for a second. You see that the number, even just between 2015 and 2017, is almost 3,000 less per year. And that's been dropping for quite a while. It's down, I believe it's about 16% over a 5-year period, while the number of new diagnoses among Hispanic and Latino MSM has actually gone up about 13% in that same time period. So this is the one population that we're seeing here that new diagnoses are continuing to increase, and we're not necessarily sure why that is. It could be because we're just simply testing them better, or it could be because there's actually an issue going on here that we're not really studying quite as much as we should. And I highlighted them again just for the purpose of that. So one of the things that people talk about when they talk about Latino health is acculturation. It's sort of like the go-to construct for this population, which is why I resisted doing this study for quite a long period of time, but here we are anyway. And so I'm going to define what acculturation is and sort of get you situated within that. And I apologize, this presentation is very word heavy, but it's a presentation, so I only apologize slightly. So acculturation is broadly defined as the process through which individuals adopt the values, norms, attitudes, behaviors, and more of what is classified as a non-heritage culture. So it's the culture into which their family or they themselves move. And it's sort of been recently, I had a lot of issues with acculturation, as I mentioned before, because it's something that's often applied to folks like me who were born in the United States and have somewhat limited exposure to my family's culture of origin, but I'm still sort of classified as highly acculturated, and that sort of seemed a little wonky to me. But it wasn't until about 2010 or so that somebody sort of addressed that in the theorization of acculturation, and they sort of helped to explain why acculturation may also impact the descendants of immigrants in different ways than it might impact immigrant populations themselves. So for example, growing up in the United States, you're exposed to broadly whatever is considered the United States culture at this moment in time. But you also, through your family and through your social networks that exist within the Latino community, you're also exposed to those sort of non-United States, in heavy quotes, cultural elements as well. So it becomes a process of balancing those ideas, those values, and those normative behaviors to some extent. And acculturation itself is not necessarily a linear process, so you don't go from being, heavily influenced by Chilean culture, which would be me if I were, to heavily influenced only by American culture. It's sort of an orthogonal, multi-directional, constant flux of a process. And some of the main ways that acculturation is studied outside of using validated scales, which are predominantly focused on language use and tap into other things, is your nativity status, so where you were born. And among those that were born outside of the United States, the amount of time that they've lived in the United States. I'm actually not going to look at the amount of, I just want to point, I'm not going to actually look at the time that they've lived in the United States, even though I'm looking at a foreign-born population in this as well, and I can explain why that is later on. And I include ethnic identity or the strength of ethnic identity as an indicator of acculturation because it's been pretty strongly linked to the processes of acculturation, at least in some of the literature, so I think that's an interesting avenue of acculturation to also consider when we're looking at this mess. And acculturation itself is not necessarily a linear process, so you don't go from being, heavily influenced by Chilean culture, which would be me if I were, to heavily influenced only by American culture. It's sort of an orthogonal, multi-directional, constant flux of a process. And some of the main ways that acculturation is studied outside of using validated scales, which are predominantly focused on language use and tap into other things, is your nativity status, so where you were born. And among those that were born outside of the United States, the amount of time that they've lived in the United States. I'm not going to actually look at the time that they've lived in the United States, even though I'm looking at a foreign-born population in this as well, and I can explain why that is later on. And I include ethnic identity or the strength of ethnic identity as an indicator of acculturation because it's been pretty strongly linked to the processes of acculturation, at least in some of the literature, so I think that's an interesting a And in terms of acculturation, it's been broadly shown, I didn't include the millions of citations looking at this in obesity, but it's been broadly shown that the more acculturated or the more adapted you are to American culture, the more you are enmeshed in those norms, generally speaking, the poorer the health is of that population. So in terms of diet and exercise, the more sort of Americanized you are, or the more Anglo-acculturated you are, the more that may negatively impact your health. Well, everything is off, it's okay. So, acculturation has also been studied in terms of HIV risk, but it's been predominantly considered as a direct correlate of HIV risk and nothing more in the majority of the literature has been considered mostly as a direct correlate of risk. And what they've shown is that in terms of heterosexual Latino populations, being more acculturated or Anglo-acculturated has been linked to more condomless sex. So again, it's this idea that Americanized culture has an adverse impact on the health of this population. But when we look at MSM, or men who have sex with men, the evidence is behind this box, which says that it's inconsistent. So there's been some studies that show that acculturation, or being more Anglo-acculturated, is linked to more receptive condomless anal sex among MSM, and other studies that have shown that it's linked to less receptive condomless anal sex. So what we're seeing is that it's a relatively unclear picture as to what's going on with acculturation in this population. And that's just one sexual behavior. There's the literature has looked at multiple different types of sexual behavior. I just pulled that one out because I think it's the cleanest example of why this is a little bit messy. And I think that might be because our understanding of what acculturation is and how we look at it in this population might need to differ from the way that we look at it in heterosexual populations. Because Latino, gay, and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men exist sort of on the margins of both the broader Latino community and the LGBTQ community. And they really sit at that intersection, so they may be influenced heavily by both of those communities, and that may in part depend on how acculturated they are. And that was actually an idea that was proposed by Rafael Diaz in the late 90s in one of his pretty foundational works in this population, or at least in Latino gay men and HIV. He argued that acculturation might be at least partly responsible for the very distinct lived experiences that Latino MSM can have. Being more Anglo-acculturated, you might find yourself more enmeshed in the broader queer community, and being being less Anglo-acculturated, you might find yourself more enmeshed in the broader Latino community. That's a very reductive way of thinking of it, but that's sort of the general logic behind that idea of it may create these sort of like distinct paths. And I don't have it on here, but there was actually a study done in 2008 that looked at the pathways from internalized and experiences of discrimination based on sexual orientation and race ethnicity in Latino, gay, and bisexual men. And the path using a structural equation modeling that reaches to HIV risk behavior. And what they found was that, I'm always horrible at explaining this study, so that's why I didn't put anything up here, but I probably should have, is that the pathways through which those experiences and internalizations reach HIV risk behavior mirror what you might expect for folks that are in the broader Latino community, through the pathway of alcohol use, and those that are in the broader queer community through drug use. And the internalization and experiences of those stigma also map onto that. So it's an interesting, so there is some evidence that there might be something like this going on, but it hasn't really been systematically examined quite as much. And so one of the things, so I wondered whether or not acculturation might act as a sort of moderator of the influences that, both the positive and negative influences that exist within the worlds of Latino, gay, and bisexual men. And in particular with their, with relation to their HIV-related risk. And effectively what I wondered is that if acculturation might be a sort of indicator, or depending on how we classify acculturation, and I'm following broadly within the literature here, depending on how we think of that, it may be the case that acculturation is creating these sort of heterogeneous, to some extent, groups of Latino, gay, and bisexual men. And so then I started to consider, what we know about HIV risk among this population and what we don't know about HIV risk in this population. In particular, some of the major correlates and some things that we've seen sort of inconsistent findings related to. So I'm not really going to talk super deeply about sexual minority stress theory. I think this group probably has a pretty decent idea about what it is. But very broadly speaking, it's the unique stressors that sexual minority populations experience based on their, and in part because of their sexual identities. And so what we've seen in the research based on Latino gay and bisexual men is that, and MSM more broadly, we've seen a sort of an unclear link of the relationship between internalized homophobia, or those internalized negative feelings that they have about their same-sex identity, same-sex behaviors or attractions or sexual identity. It's been relatively inconsistently linked with HIV risk behavior, and particularly in Latino gay and bisexual men. And while sexual orientation-based discrimination has historically been pretty consistently linked with HIV-related risk behavior in this population, there's actually a study that was done in 2015 that sort of identified that that may be predominantly only in foreign-born Latino MSM, not necessarily the broader Latino MSM population. And it was also not necessarily just sexual orientation-based discrimination. They looked at social discrimination, so they grouped together racial, ethnic, and sexual orientation-based discrimination. So there may be something also going on here that is sort of gestating, and we haven't really discovered whether or not, you know, the historic information we have about discrimination is still true to HIV risk behavior today. And so I started to wonder whether or not acculturation acts as a moderator of this, in part because of that finding from the 2015 paper that foreign-born and US-born populations, Latino men who have sex with men, may be differentially influenced by discrimination in relation to their HIV risk. And I'm also not going to talk super long about social norms theory. It's just sort of the general idea that the people around us, especially those that we perceive as our peers, their normative behaviors and ideas and how we perceive them impact our own behaviors and ideas. And it's sort of deeply ingrained within, or I guess maybe it's parallel to, orthogonal to, I don't know, acculturation theory, because again, acculturation is the process through which you adopt values, norms, etc. of different cultural ideas. And social norms have broadly been linked to population health, in particular health-related behaviors. And in terms of condomless sex, what we've seen is that both within, particularly within MSM populations and Latino MSM, I think in 1 or 2 studies, if I remember correctly, pure condom use norms, or the ideas that about norms that your peers have related to condom use, has been linked to less condomless anal sex in particular. But I wondered whether or not acculturation might moderate these relationships, because there was a meta-analysis done on condom use norms in particular, and what they found is that those norms are particularly strong or particularly impactful for men or for ethnic minority men. But I wondered whether or not it's just simply their ethnic identity, or whether it's the sort of strength with which they value that ethnic identity. So I did a secondary data analysis of the NYC M2M study, which was done between the years of 2010 and 2013. That's important to note because I'm not really going to talk about PrEP at all today, and that's because PrEP really wasn't in the picture during that time. So that's a major limitation and something that you can just pretend didn't happen if you want to. That'd be great. Otherwise, you can critique it. And so it was a venue-based time-space sampling. They used venue-based time-space sampling and internet-based sampling. And internet-based sampling was sort of added because things like Grindr and other hookup apps were becoming more popular during those times. And what they did is they collected contact information from everybody that responded and was interested, and they were invited to the study site. And I can't remember what's down there, so I'm just going to pretend it's not important. So the eligibility criteria for the study are up at the top. So they only recruited cisgender identified males who were 18 years of age or older and lived in New York City, and were able to communicate according to their language that they used in the eligibility criteria, were able to communicate effectively in English or Spanish. And they limited the study to men who had anal sex with a male partner in the past 3 months. So this is not necessarily generalizable to all MSM or Latino MSM, sorry, the study itself, MSM in New York City, but it is a slightly higher risk for HIV transmission and acquisition population. And I additionally limited it just to the Hispanic and Latino subsample. And I also limited it to HIV positive and HIV negative self-reported serostatus. And the reason that I excluded unknown serostatus is the outcome that I'm using is serodiscordant condomless anal sex. So it's a little bit difficult to classify exactly what is serodiscordant for somebody who is unsure of their serostatus. I could have included them in one group or the other, and I wanted to keep the groups as coherent as possible. So some of the sample characteristics in my lovely rainbow flag here with black and brown text. So we see that the sample is quite highly educated, although that's not necessarily I'm currently looking at nationally representative data, and that's not super different from what we're seeing in gay identified men. But they're also a very low earning subsample of the group. More than half of them were earning under $20,000 a year as their personal income. The slight majority of them were single. The vast majority of the sample was gay identified, and a little bit less than 30% were self-identified as being HIV positive, while the average age was a little bit over 30 years old. So we got measures. I'm not going to go into great detail about how I classified serodiscordant condoms anal sex, because I feel like you're going to read it while I'm talking anyway, because that's what we do in presentations. But effectively, what I did was I back calculated it from a number of questions that they were asked. So they were asked the total number of male partners that they had anal sex within the past 3 months, and then they were asked the serostatus of each of those partners in order. So it was, of those 100 partners, how many were HIV positive? So if you say 20, then of those 80, how many were you unsure of their HIV status, et cetera. And then within each of those serostatuses, they were asked about insertive and receptive, or topping and bottoming with those partners. And those definitions were given in the instructions or in the questions. And then they were asked about using condoms for the length of that sexual encounter with those partners. So they effectively asked questions about condom use for insertive and receptive behaviors for each partner or for all partners within each of those serostatus groups. And so what I did is I simply subtracted the number of partners they reported using condoms with or the number of encounters they reported using condoms for the entirety from the total number of encounters they had with each of those partners of that serostatus. And so serodiscordant condomless anal sex for this group was, if a participant were HIV positive, then it would be with somebody whose HIV status was unknown and HIV negative. And the same is true or the reverse is true for the HIV negative folks. So I have a bunch of measures, because that's what we used. We used measures. In particular, I'm going to point out that we used the lifetime, we used a modified version, or they used a modified version of the heterosexist harassment, rejection, and discrimination scale. I point this out because when we see the average of this score, it's going to look like it's relatively low. But what this is actually reflecting is the frequency with which they've experienced unfair treatment from a list of 16 types of folks over the course of their life. So the response scale is really, they've never experienced it, they've experienced it sometimes, they've experienced it, it's frequently, and then a lot of time, and then most of the time. So when you see a low average, it's sort of somewhat intuitive, right? Because it's not as if, well, maybe they are, but it's generally not expected that, MSM are experiencing sexual orientation-based discrimination most of the time from all of these different types of people. So when you see that average, it's low because of that. I actually, when I was going back and putting together this presentation, I was like, is that supposed to be that way? So I had a little bit of a heart attack because this has already been submitted. So thankfully I didn't do, well, maybe I did other things wrong, but not that. And I forgot to include the alphas for these measures, but they were all, I think the lowest was about 0.83. They were all pretty decently reliable in this subsample. I'm also using 3 indicators of acculturation. And what I'm using is a short subscale related to language use, which is from the mid-'80s. So it's been pretty widely used, although I have some issues with it, but it's been pretty widely used. I'm also using nativity status, which is something that I also had issues with because I have issues, I guess. And what we did is we classified men that were identified being born within the United States, so within one of the 50 states of the United States, and we contrasted them with men who were reported being born anywhere else. And that anywhere else also includes US territories. And the reason I did that, although I don't necessarily like doing that, is that it's consistent with the other study that was done in 2015 that sort of inspired this. So I aim to try to keep this as comparable to that, so that way I could, have at least something to compare it to. And we can certainly talk about why that is may not be the best approach. And we also use the multi-group ethnic identification measure, which really measures the sort of strength with which people identify their ethnic identity. So there was a picture of my dog in there, but I took it out because that's a little unprofessional. He's at the end. Don't worry, you can see him later. So this shouldn't say sample characteristics, but it does. So these are the well, I guess this is sort of some sample characteristics. So this is the averages for the measures and including the percent that were born in the US and outside. So we see a little bit less than a third of the sample were born somewhere outside of the United States. I really was hoping that that number would be a lot bigger because my initial hope for this paper was to really look at the importance of country of origin, not just grouping folks that were born outside of the United States. And we see that the group is predominantly English speaking or is skewed towards more English use, with the average being just under 4 out of 5. And they're also relatively strongly identified with their ethnic group, which is interesting to consider. And they have relatively low levels or on average low levels of internalized homophobia. And this is that sort of the low frequency that I mentioned. So largely what we're seeing is that they sometimes have experienced discrimination from a wide variety of folks. And then the condom use norms are also relatively high or relatively positive. A higher number there indicates that they believe their peers have more positive condom use norms. Okay, so then what did I do with all this information? So I ran a multivariable negative binomial regression model. We use negative binomial because the outcome variable is the count of encounters that they had, not a sort of did you or did you not, or is it more or less than a number of encounters. So I was interested to see how this might be useful for studies like this, because a lot of the times we really classify people as a yes, no, and don't really try to get at that nuance within the yes group, if that makes any sense. And then I ran 3 additional models looking at the moderating effects of the indicators of acculturation. So that was the language use scale, where they were born, and the strength of their ethnic identity on each of these indicators. So tested the moderations for internalized homophobia in model number 2, discrimination in model number 3, and then peer condom use norms in model number 4. And all the models controlled for age, education, annual income, sexual identity, HIV status, and social support. So again, I also wanted to look at this separately in HIV positive and HIV negative men, because I feel like that's an important distinction. But because of the sample sizes, I really wasn't able to do so. So I'm going to sort of briefly go through the results of model 1, although they're not super important because acculturation does moderate things, but it's still, I think it's important to see what it looks like at the baseline. I don't know why I have that block there. So what we generally see is that neither of the sexual minority stressors are related to or have a significant relationship with the number of serodiscordant condomal anal sex encounters these men have, at least not directly related to them. But we see, as you might expect, that having more positive peer condom use norms or having peers that have more positive condom use norms is associated with a lower likelihood of engaging in serodiscordant condomal anal sex. That's very consistent with the literature that sort of effectively shows that in a broad variety of populations, maybe not necessarily with this outcome. And what we also see is that speaking more English or being more English oriented is associated with a lower likelihood of serodiscordant condomal anal sex. So that sort of supports some of the evidence that's out there, but not all of the evidence that's out there. It again contributes to the sort of unclear picture of what acculturation, or at least language use, does in relation to HIV risk. And we see being born in the United States compared to being born outside of the United States is also related to, is related to a greater likelihood of engaging in more serodiscordant condomal anal sex. So it's interesting to consider how language use and the place that you're born have differing impacts on serodiscordant condomal anal sex. But none of this necessarily matters unless acculturation doesn't moderate any of that. So I'm going to show you the graphical representation of the moderation for just the internalized homophobia model, and then for the peer condom use norms model, because the discrimination model looks very much like the internalized homophobia model. So here we go, models 2 and 4. And so what I did here, just for graphical representation, I did standard deviation splits of both the internalized homophobia, so that's the plus or minus 1 standard deviation away from the mean is the low, -1 is the low group, and +1 is the high group. And I did the same for English language use, so -1 for -1 standard deviation away from the mean is lower levels of English use, and I put that in heavy quotes, whereas +1 is more or greater levels of English use. And on the right-hand side, I'm sorry, on the left-hand side on the y-axis is the predicted probability of engaging in that behavior of serodiscordant condoms anal sex. So what we see is that for those that are lower in English use, there isn't necessarily a direct relationship between internalized homophobia and serodiscordant condoms anal sex. But when we look at the folks that are more inclined to English language use or have more predominant English use, we see that as internalized homophobia goes up, so too does the likelihood of engaging in serodiscordant condoms anal sex. And so we also see that where these folks are born acts as a moderator as well, but it does so in a way that is different from that. So for the foreign-born population, we see the similar pattern as we do for those that are higher in English language use. So in other words, what we're seeing here is, again, a slightly inconsistent idea of what acculturation might be doing for this population. It's different. There are different patterns depending on the indicator of acculturation that we're looking at. And I should say that ethnic identification did not moderate this relationship. And the only thing that ethnic identification did, nor did it moderate the influence of discrimination on serodiscordant condoms anal sex. But what it does moderate is the influence on peer condom use norms, which the other indicators of acculturation don't. So there's an importance in looking at each of those indicators depending on your question of interest. But what we see, again, we have a standard deviation split for each of these indicators. And what we see is that for those that are high in ethnic identification, the protective effect of having positive peer condom use norms is most stark. Whereas those that are lower in ethnic identification, it doesn't necessarily seem to have as much of an impact. So as a summary, if you've survived, like I think I did after working on this for 800 years as a doctoral student, acculturation indicators do seem to function as moderators, but the way that they do differs depending on the type of indicator that you look at. And while it's a limitation of this study that we didn't use a really well-validated, to some extent the language use scale is validated, or it is a validated scale, but it's not a multi-dimensional scale of acculturation that taps into multiple elements of acculturation. That's a bit of a limitation of this study, but because of that limitation, I also looked at nativity, and by doing that, I discovered something that I wasn't necessarily planning to see. So it's important to consider what you use as an indicator of acculturation in this population and how you categorize it. So I like to think of, this gets me in trouble with my advisor a lot because I talk about it as diverging or differing results, and it's sort of similar results, but whatever. So the links between each of the sexual minority stressors, internalized homophobia and experiences of discrimination, are strongest for both groups that we might sort of reductively classify as being higher and lower in acculturation. So that's high being those English language, sort of Anglo acculturated folks, and potentially lower being those that are born outside of the United States that have a more direct influence from their culture of origin as well. And that's that difference is important for how we consider acculturation as not necessarily being just a directly linear process, or being that, because you were born outside of the United States, you were definitely low in acculturation. This is telling us that there's something going on with acculturation that might be unique to this population. And this might help to explain some of the inconsistent findings that we have in the literature that internalized homophobia is and is not related to HIV risk behavior among this population. And maybe because we're looking at this population as a homogeneous population in multiple ways, and this is one way that homogeneity might be limiting our understanding of the population, or that pursuit of homogeneity might be limiting our understanding of them. And peer condom use norms are most protective among those that are higher in ethnic identification. And that maps onto the broader literature that shows that, again, I mentioned before, the ethnic identity, or at least among ethnic minorities, these norms might exert a stronger influence. So it may not just necessarily be that I, as an ethnic minority individual, am purposely influenced by my peer norms, but it might depend on how strongly I identify with that ethnic identity. So I think it's important that in moving forward in studying Latino MSM, I think it's important that we perhaps stop calling them just Latino MSM and start considering the multiple subgroup differences that exist within them. I think this is just one small piece of the differences, and as I mentioned before, I wasn't able to look at many of the other differences like culture of origin, or even looking at Puerto Rico or folks from Puerto Rico as a separate subgroup. So it's important that we consider each of these different elements that might contribute to heterogeneous profiles or heterogeneous beliefs and values among these populations, among the broader Latino population. And as I mentioned before, additional work is really needed to look at those different subcultures and subgroups by country of origin, just to determine whether or not it's important to do so. I know that there's historically been some research on that, but that research is about 20 years old at this point, so it might be time to start to consider how they look within a more modern context. And something that I wasn't expecting to find, but I found, is that it may be the case that we're not really considering the needs of predominantly English-speaking Latino MSM, because they're often captured in these sort of ethnically diverse samples of men, so we don't really get to study what might be culturally relevant to them. So it may simply be the case that we need to pursue the ideas through research and potentially through interventions if other studies corroborate this, that this is a subgroup that is in particular, or has particular needs that we might not be meeting in terms of HIV prevention. And I sort of mentioned the ethnic identification piece before. So there's about 8,000 limitations to this study, as there are for, well, I think most studies only have 7,000. This study was predominantly comprised of folks born in the United States and folks that predominantly spoke English. I don't think that we had a large sample of folks that predominantly spoke Spanish. So these findings don't really generalize to that population. I think at best we're looking at, I don't remember exactly where the -1 standard deviation is, but I think at best we're looking at sort of like a bilingual-ish group versus a more monolingual English group. So I think that's important to consider as well, because this is not really a study of monolingual Spanish-speaking Latino MSM. And we really didn't have any access to information on biomedical prevention strategies, which I think is a major limitation and why I want this paper to get published really soon instead of in like a couple of years when it will just get flatly rejected. But part of that is because PrEP was really not available at that time. It received FDA approval, I think it was like months before the study ended. But to be perfectly honest, it's really, the uptake among Latino MSM has been pretty bad. So, I mean, I think I would need to say that more academically speaking, but it's to some extent, in terms of PrEP alone, I don't know that that would necessarily change too much about the findings of this study never mind. We also didn't have any information on the viral status of the partners. So yes, they were engaging in sex, HIV-negative men who engaged in serodiscordant sex with HIV-positive partners. We don't know the viral loads of those partners, or even their perceptions of the viral loads of those partners, and how that might have influenced their decisions to have condomless sex with those partners. And I mentioned before that I used what are considered unidimensional indicators of acculturation. Using validated multidimensional scales would be much better, but unfortunately this is a secondary data analysis, so all of the limitations are not my problem, except they are my problem. They weren't my decisions. But again, as I mentioned before, this did open up an avenue of including things like nativity status that I wouldn't have pursued before with that multidimensional scale. So, you win some, you lose some, I guess. But it does beg the question of how comparable this might be to the other work on Latino MSM that typically use mostly one scale, but typically use a multidimensional scales. And it was a secondary analysis of cross-sectional data, and I'll give you the email addresses of the people who did the study if you want to complain about the study itself. Just kidding, I would never do that. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, and also my dissertation committee, of which both Eric Scrimshaw and Victoria Fry were also part of that. And the NYC M2M team, the PI was Beryl Koblin, who I didn't identify by name earlier. And I also like to thank the participants of the study as well, because I think that it's important that we pay homage to them. And I had a whole host of different funding mechanisms throughout my time as both a grad student and as a postdoc now. So I would like to acknowledge them as well. And they're the promised pictures of my dog. So if you learn nothing else from the study, I have a cute dog.
Very, very nice data. I'm particularly struck by the findings of ethnic identification versus peer group norms. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that if you're strongly identified, these two groups are highly different in their social and sexual networks, mm-hmm. that the highly identified somehow have brought some of the family over or some of the hometown group.
Right.
If they have peer group norms that are very common supportive, and the others, for whatever accidental reasons, didn't manage that and live more and more isolated and sort of circling around in other groups than their traditional home groups. Is that such a difference possible? Do you have any data along those lines?
I have zero data in my life, but I do think that it's important to consider the feelings of inclusion and exclusion that come with exactly what you're talking about. So if you are, if you are in the example that you gave of being deeply enmeshed within the Latino community because your family came over, because you have those social networks that revolve around that. The alternative, I mean, it's not a clear alternative because there are multiple variations, but the alternative is being deeply enmeshed in the LGBTQ community, which comes with both benefits because you are also exposed to their norms related to condom use, but also racial and ethnic discrimination within that sub-community. So it may be the case that some of these men are experiencing, what we call the sort of like preference of partner selection, where they may be feeling motivated to make sexual decisions that they wouldn't otherwise make because of the feelings of exclusion they're having by other sexual partners, if that makes any sense. So it's not necessarily it can also be a supportive network, the LGBTQ community, but it does have issues with race and racism that I think particularly impact men of color in ways that may influence the importance of norms in that group because they may not necessarily feel as deeply attuned in the same way they might to the Latino community, I guess. Yeah.
This is really interesting and very clear.
Thank you.
That. So my question is about racism and effects of discrimination, because among men who might be categorized as Latino, there's a wide range of potential racial identities
Yep.
as well, so their exposure could be different. And I wonder
Absolutely.
how that's been addressed in the literature or how it could be addressed in the future.
Yeah, so the reason that I didn't include racial and ethnic discrimination is because they did another study from this data actually looking at that. They grouped together the Black and Latino subsample. And I wish I remember the exact findings, but from memory, so they asked a question about experiences of racial and ethnic discrimination, I believe within neighborhood contexts, so within the neighborhood in which they live and the neighborhood in which they typically socialize. And if I'm remembering correctly, and I apologize if I'm wrong, but what they showed is that racial ethnic discrimination does have a negative impact on the HIV risk behavior of those that conjoined population. Now they didn't, if I remember correctly, they didn't necessarily look at those by race ethnicity. They grouped them together as men of color, but there has been some research looking at that. But the one study that I mentioned from 2015 actually looked at racial ethnic discrimination, sexual orientation-based discrimination, and then the two of them together. And if I'm remembering correctly, they didn't find direct relationships between either of those with HIV-related risk, but they did when they put them together as sort of a social discrimination piece.
So that just leads to a follow-up question about that there's, one of the messages here is that there's heterogeneity among people who are categorized as Latino.
Yeah.
And so I wonder to what extent some of that might be driven by the different perception based on skin tone.
Sure.
That Latinos
Yep.
are exposed to.
Absolutely. I think that's a phenomenal question. I don't think that we really have studied that to the extent that we really need to. I know that this sample, even though it came from New York, it's a very, like the subgroups are sort of, I mean, it's predominantly like Puerto Rican and Latin American, some South American, and very few folks from the Dominican Republic, for example. And my ideal approach for this study would have been to look at those different subgroups and to look at racial ethnic discrimination as part of that, because I feel like exactly what you're mentioning is, like, even in the other study I mentioned, like they don't disaggregate by subgroups that might be particularly impacted by racial and ethnic discrimination because of things like colorism. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
All right, that'll be our last question. Sorry.
Okay. No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
His primary interest is how stigma impacts health and HIV, vulnerability of marginalized populations, with much of his research being with sexual minority refugees and migrants in East Africa. While in Kenya as a Fulbright student researcher, Michael helped LGBTIQ refugees create the Refugee Coalition of East Africa, an organization which advocates for research and representation of the larger human rights mechanisms in Kenya and Uganda. Many of the people he works with experience stigma through multiple intersecting identities as a sexual minority, a refugee, being gender non-conforming, living in poverty as a sex worker, and often as living with HIV. Michael's research and advocacy seeks to find the power through these intersections. Also, prior to academia, Michael served as a combat medic in the U.S. Army. And my favorite fact, he has 2 dogs named Bacon and Eggs.
Yes. And they're like long dogs like yours. So I don't have pictures of them. I'm sorry. Hi. So I am Michael, and I'm going to be talking about 2 bits of research that I kind of started initially in my undergrad and did between my undergrad and my master's. So I'm like just a baby. So be kind, but I am open to criticism. All right. So my broad research interest is, what is it? Sexuality, migration, and health, and how those all kind of intersect. A lot of research has looked at how migration affects your health. And some really interesting research by like Paul Spiegel has shown that being a refugee is actually kind of like protective for HIV. If there's a refugee community, the surrounding community has higher rates of HIV than the community of refugees itself. And I'm like, I don't think that's the case for LGBT refugees. So that was one of my research questions. Does being displaced and being a sexual gender or minority kind of affect your HIV vulnerability? And then kind of another piece of that, which may seem kind of different, but it actually does relate quite well. Can we reduce HIV risk by improving the livelihoods of LGBT refugees? And just terminology, I use sexual orientation and gender, my identity and sex characteristics in what I write, but it's just a little easier to say LGBT, so pardon that. So just very briefly and generally, I'm going to talk about homophobia in sub-Saharan Africa. I think people are probably very familiar with, there's a lot of laws criminalizing same-sex acts, but that doesn't necessarily change the fact of how people identify. So one aspect that I just wanted to mention is kind of like the economic aspect, and how one study by Melander and Williams Institute is also doing a lot of research on this, is how does this little guy work right here? Oh, no. Anyway, what, the bottom one? Top one, okay. How there's a correlation between a Gallup poll of being gay and lesbian friendly and GDP. Most sub-Saharan Africa countries are right here, with the exception of like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and stuff like that. And then you have like Switzerland and Netherlands and United States and stuff up here. But the majority of, and I can actually show you those, but this graphic doesn't really show that, are all down here. So in some degrees, more money can help make the life better for an LGBT person. The area of interest is here in East Africa, and what has happened, because people are in their homes or in their village or whatever, and they get driven, their family finds out that they're gay or that they have a same-sex partner or something like that, and they flee. And generally it's coming from DRC, South Sudan, Rwanda, Burundi, and a lot of them went to Uganda because Uganda is very, very open about their refugee policies. And so they'll go to Uganda because of like war and conflict happening in DRC, in Burundi, and like kind of like slide in and claim themselves as a refugee, but then it comes through the protection interview then they kind of declare their same sex, their sexuality and stuff like that. So my first research was talking to these people. This was my undergrad. It was a small semi-structured interviews with 40 people in refugee camps and also in Kampala. It was done in French with a trusted interpreter in the community. And some of the findings of the interviews really kind of highlighted the stigma that people are experiencing, and how the stigma was a strong barrier to them receiving like equitable healthcare, just the same as anybody else. Like some of the really kind of shocking things were, this one person described they would go to the clinic like every day to get their medicine and never be called on because it was very visibly like trans person. And it's just like these stories were so repetitive almost, and it really kind of emphasized the fact that if you're outside of a gender norm, or you're kind of known to be gay, then the healthcare, even in the camp that's supposed to be helping people, would not either give them medication, or they would have trouble like traveling to and from the clinic, stuff like that. So I'm not really going to read these. Yeah.
Didn't Uganda at that time have the death penalty for homosexuality?
You're right. Good job. No, actually, it wasn't a death penalty. It was a kill the gays bill, and it was life in prison. So that started in 2009, and was overturned in 2014. However, that doesn't necessarily stop when you are fleeing for your life from DRC. You're going to the safest place that you can think of, and you're not necessarily thinking Uganda is not a really friendly place. But that does play into this. This did have a very big impact, and one thing it did do was kind of create a very tight-knit gay community within Uganda. But there certainly was a difference between like the Ugandan gay community and then like the gay refugees. Like they don't interact at all. But because of that bill, it kind of sparked this really unique like wave of migration. And I think it's very unique because this is one of the first times where we kind of had a mass movement of people across the continent. You know, all the way from DRC, there were some people from Central African Republic who went through Uganda to Kenya. And this wasn't due to anything other than their sexual orientation or gender identity. So it's really, really, really interesting. So they did this, and then they went over here, and the majority of them went to Kenya, to Nairobi. But if you can also see right up here, Kakuma is a big refugee camp. It was at the time the second largest in the world. And that's where people who couldn't make it in Nairobi as an urban refugee were sent to the camp, and they kind of created a cluster of 250 refugees there. So after the research in Uganda, the following year I went to Nairobi for my Fulbright and was working within the community and kind of met up with researchers that were doing this transform study. Adrian Smith from University of Oxford was very, very interested in the topic, and we spent a lot of time kind of like talking about the differences between a gay Kenyan and a refugee, a gay refugee, and just kind of, and he was able to help me kind of like pull some of the data out. And so the transform study, which is where this data came from, was 618 men or assigned male at birth in Nairobi County who've had consensual oral or anal intercourse in the last 12 months. And so this is Kenyans and non-Kenyans. But of those 618, there were 100 that reported their birth outside of Kenya. So these were the refugees. A really kind of a big cluster. I mean, that's 1/6 of it. The majority originated from Uganda. but came from a couple other countries also. But my original question of, does being a sexual minority and a refugee affect your HIV status? And here it appears it doesn't. Migrants reporting, 9%, Kenyans about 30%. So there's something going on there, because you would think that being a sexual minority and facing the stigma and discrimination that you do as a refugee kind of would make things, and the economics, the low economics, you would think that would cause your HIV to be a spike. Well, come to find out that UNHCR actually does puts a priority on HIV positive people. So if you are not very adherent to your medication or having problems with your HIV, then you get resettled very quickly. So that would be a limitation of the study, because a bunch of people were resettled that we don't really know about. But even like gonorrhea and chlamydia, also much lower rates. When you look at these two communities side by side, what's really interesting is the rates of unemployment and the employment insecurity of the refugees, which are on the left, versus the gay Kenyans on the right. The amount of money that people make per month, this is $50 versus $86. And then another interesting aspect is the number of people that each refugee considers a dependent or somebody that they're like responsible for. A gay Kenyan who has, a gay refugee who has left their family on their own indicates that they're responsible for 14 people, whereas just the average gay Kenyan indicates that they're responsible for about 5 people. So if you've left your family and your community and you're all alone, how come you have 14 people? Well, that's a very interesting thing to look at that I'll come back to. When it comes to stigma and discrimination, these are the gay Kenyans, which are really high, particularly when you're looking at like physical assault and sexual assault or avoided healthcare. But when you look at just the gay refugees, it's much higher. And I mean, it's kind of in line with what I also had learned in Uganda, that people are afraid to seek health care, the police are failing to protect them, and they're being physically and sexually assaulted. In terms of mental health, the migrants have nearly twice the rate of clinical depression versus a regular gay Kenyan. And when we associate the clinical depression with the stigma, and discrimination, we see that there's four times greater odds of police harassment with healthcare, with clinical depression, or violence with clinical depression. And just kind of an interesting thing, although not incredibly like super significant, for every $1,000 or for every like $10 that you add to somebody's income, it indicates that their depression goes down a little bit. So kind of like, what does this mean? Well, HIV vulnerability is not necessarily as big of an issue as we would have expected. And from like the USAID world and global funders, they've indicated that, and so they won't fund HIV projects for refugees. But stigma, mental health, and poverty are still really crippling issues. And in Kenya today, there's about 850 refugees still there waiting for resettlement. They're there from 3 to 5 years, sometimes as long as 6, 7 years. With a monthly income of about $45. They don't receive any type of financial support. Incredibly, most of their day-to-day livelihoods come from GoFundMe, which is really kind of crazy. Because they also can't work, and it makes it very difficult for them to have a regular life. They live in groups of 10 to 30 people. This is kind of a really interesting thing. that I come back to, and they're not really accepted by like the gay Kenya community. So you see all this repeal 162 and about the decriminalization and stuff like that. Gay refugees are not really involved in this movement. They're really, I think it's like xenophobia and racism that is really separating them out from the gay community in Kenya, which is really robust. But they're also not accepted by like the refugee communities. So again, they're very socially isolated, and they kind of really only depend on their small groups of 10 to 30 people. And one thing to think about, kind of like a way forward. You know, I'm at first kind of like an activist and community organizer. So you know, I go there within this community, and I'm like, we can't just not do anything, you know, like let's try to do something. And so when I was there for my Fulbright, we did like a series of community meetings and really kind of like talked about solutions on how we can help make livelihoods better for people. And really kind of the big things: stigma reduction, mental health, and livelihoods or some sort of economics. So when I talk about the groups of 10 to 30 people, this is what they are. They've formed these houses of, that's their family. It's kind of a chosen family. It's fascinating. It's kind of like, have you watched Pose? Have you ever seen that? You know, it's kind of like Harlem ballroom scene houses, because they take care of, you know, they have a leadership structure. They take care of each other like a family. They provide the food and housing and all that kind of stuff. And it's really, really very, very interesting. But from a community organizing point of view, it makes a really good opportunity to like unite people, because they work very individually. But through these meetings that we had and stuff, we kind of like, well, if you guys all kind of have these same goals, don't like go against each other. Let's like, you know, find the power in your voice. And so they were able to form this Refugee Coalition of East Africa, which is a refugee-led organization that goes for advocacy, long-term strategy for refugees, fundraising, and advocating for more research into their community. Because, you know, if nobody's doing research in this group of people, then they're not able to get funding. They're not able to do anything in a long-term sense. And then I think with the decriminalization that's likely going to happen in Kenya, we're going to see a bigger influx of people from East Africa and surrounding countries coming to Kenya, and they're going to be in the same exact situation. And so that makes something like the Refugee Coalition much more important. So that's one thing that we did to combat stigma. To combat poverty, the coalition created the Spark Fund, which is using crowdfunding to give just chunks of cash to small refugee groups. And we gave them $2,000. People submitted business proposals. And right now we have a chicken farm. We have a group that's making sandals and trying to sell them on the internet, mobile caterers, and a media studio. And each of these is employing about 10 people with a very modest salary, but it's like better than not doing anything. So it's really starting to change people's outlook a little bit. And then in terms of mental health, that's still a really big issue. The coalition's applying for funding. I'm personally going to be going there this summer to kind of do a baseline mental health assessment and try to get like actual data, because there really is no data existing. And that's kind of my summer project for my MPH. And then that's it. Thank you. Yes.
What is the fate of transsexual men?
Oh.
Men who want to be women, or at least at times act as women, but
Yeah.
cannot come out publicly for it, right?
Well, there's a very big community of trans.
Separate?
No, they consider themselves part of this. If you look here, 14%. I would say it's maybe a little higher. identify as transgender. That's this study was male assigned at birth, so that is only including trans women. I know there's a big community of also trans men. Also, like, gender expression in this part of Africa is very different than what we would consider it. A lot of times I feel that there is a very rigid male expression versus a female expression. And if you kind of are not one or the other, you're in the middle, you might consider yourself trans. So if you're like a feminine man, but you don't have the identity of being a woman, you still may consider yourself trans. That's not like been scientifically examined or anything like that. That's just from working with this community what I get the feeling. The other aspect is, for protection reasons, differing out of your gender identity, one form of gender identity can be very dangerous. And so you may have people who are wearing lipstick and dresses and identify as female, but they'll have like full facial hair and stuff like that. So it's a really interesting concept, and the trans community is actually very well organized. We actually just, of those houses, we just added 2 houses that are exclusively trans to kind of like advocate for their unique issues. Because there also is, of the Uganda study, 100% of the people who identified as transgender also indicated that they do sex work. So sex work is, whereas the other communities maybe were about 80%. Really, really high instances of sex work. If you combine sex work also with having issues receiving medical care, then you can see how like public health issues can really explode. So, thank you. Yes?
So just thinking about both of the studies that you presented, I was thinking about how acculturation would impact the work that you're doing. I don't know a lot about Kenyan culture, but it seems what I've heard a little bit about is that community is also very diverse based on tribe. And I wonder if some of that tribal language issue, hierarchy, is impacting the refugees and their ability to reduce their harm and disparities by building community.
Yeah, well, it's almost, that's a barrier, because the xenophobia is so strong. I mean, and xenophobia really isn't the right word, racism isn't the right word, but it's a tribal, you are of this tribe, and we are of this tribe, and we don't want to accept you. You would think, I mean, here, you're like, oh, you're gay, I'm gay, cool, we know each other. Like, it's not like that there. It can be very much, oh, in fact, kind of an anecdote is, there's this gay club in Nairobi that is the craziest gay club you will ever go to. I mean, we are talking like, wow. It's really, really fun, but it's also like really, really inexpensive. And so there's other gay clubs in Nairobi that Kenyans will go to. And then you say, well, don't you want to go to Club LA? And they're like, ooh, no, that's gross. That's kind of seedy. Because it's where all the Ugandans go. All the refugees go there because it's really cheap. But I'll tell you one thing, at 3 a.m., who do you find there? You find all those Kenyans. Yes? Yes.
But then I would imagine if the refugees are doing sex work, who are their clients? They must be, I don't know, likely that they're Kenyans or they're also refugees who don't identify as.
Or they're straight men.
But who are Kenyans?
Yeah. So this, in the refugee camps, actually, this was a really big issue because it's such a closed community. And people that were working in the refugee camps would have, their clients were married and stuff with children. There were a few instances that you get frantic phone calls in the middle of the night because the guy was drunk and he came back into their protected area and started like attacking people because he's like, my wife found out and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, who their clients are can be kind of, it's whoever who has money. A lot of times it's actually just Westerners. Because if you go on like Grindr or something like that, you'll see that. You know, you'd pop up as the white guy. They're like, "Hi, do you need a boyfriend for the night?" And I'm like, "Okay, no." Yes.
This is a wonderful blend of passion and research, and really
Thank you.
admire what you're doing. And on the academic side, I think this is the anecdotal, of course, but it seems like you and others you're working with have been part of providing housing.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing something like microfinance, chicken farms, and such.
Yes.
And there is an organizing element which maybe happened naturally with people being, depending each.
People being powerless, and it's just realizing, yeah.
If I'm a funder and you're applying to me
Here's my card.
study, to study a way of intervening,
Mm-hmm.
would one put your money on any one of these in particular?
I mean, recognizing that that's a huge issue, that there's no way to enter this community easily. That's why we formed the coalition, and that was what a few of the members said we want to do. We want to make it easier for a researcher to come in here and to communicate with all of us. We'll hire us as a research assistant. We'll give you access to the community. We'll help you like navigate all that kind of stuff. We would love to do that. And actually, since we formed, really interestingly, there's a guy from France that just said, "I do PR. I'll do free PR for you guys." So if you Google the Refugee Coalition of East Africa, there's all of this press that's popping up. And so now we're getting a couple researchers. There's some people from the University of Minnesota, someone from University in South Africa, and Oxford are all contacting the coalition to say, we want to work with you guys to kind of look into here more. And then separate from that, my work, I work at Health Right International, which is a health and human rights organization attached to NYU, founded by Jonathan Mann, who you might know. We just worked with the American Refugee Committee to apply for a BPRM grant, which is the Bureau of Population Migration Management of the State Department, which is a really, really big grant to provide mental health and to provide livelihoods and stuff like that. So, but they're doing it with their local partner being the Refugee Coalition. So it's kind of working out. It just kind of, I don't know, it worked out really, really great. And trust me, you have to deal with lots of WhatsApp messages at all hours from every little tiny issue. But it's been really interesting to see it kind of grow and to see people who felt really, really powerless and not having, arbitrarily arrested or being denied medical care. And now when one person's arrested, it gets mobilized through this coalition, and then 10 people are there petitioning the police or contacting a lawyer or something like that. So it's really kind of exciting to see that kind of stuff. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Maybe I missed it, but were you looking at any before or after mental health outcomes? I mean, you showed the really high rates, but with the microfinance or
right.
Are you planning to?
I hope to use the same measures this summer and compare it to what we had in 2017. I mean, I would love to do a before, implement a program, and then assess. That's down the road if we can get funding for it. But I mean, also it's I'm a little over my head already with being just a master's student. but yes, I would love to do that, and I would also like to get interest. If any of you are interested in something like this is an amazing project that needs it's ready to be explored.
I don't know if you're familiar with I saw Mala's work, Subi in Uganda, but he's like really a leader in microfinance and has shown for not necessarily for LGBTQ, but for general adolescents, that microfinance leads to decreased hopelessness, improved mental health outcomes. So if you're not, you should check that out.
Yeah, give me the name before you leave,
sure.
please.
And I also think it's really interesting that in the issues of HIV rates not seeing increased among recent migrants. I wonder how much of that might be like methodological challenges or short issues with data. I mean, for example,
I agree.
Because I think it's really hard to look at incidents, and especially across Africa, there's only a few data sets that can do this well. And so one of them is the Rakai data, and so that what they've shown is mainly in-country migrants, that it is recent migrants who are at greatest risk of incidents. So I would say keep that as something to continue to examine about why you're maybe not seeing that, and so I wouldn't give up on, or I would continue to pay attention to that issue.
Okay, excellent.
I know you are.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for a citation to support in migrants, there's a recent HIV Lancet study from that group.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you. I mean, yeah, I firmly believe that it's going to be a higher rate. It's just, there's no reason. And it's just how we're examining it or how the data is coming out that we're not seeing it. But I know for sure it is.
This is where, I think your experience on the ground don't always match up. So when quantitative data is so powerful that sometimes there may be gaps in it. So I think considering how you might use your expertise on the ground to understand where these gaps are could be good.
Okay, thank you. Awesome. Yes?
I would just, I know this is a cisgender male population. I would just kind of general about that. What is the distribution of cisgender women in these refugee camps? And has that data been looked at in the experience of the women who may be somewhere on the spectrum, sexual, been looked at? Yes.
So, I mean, in most of these studies, women are grossly underlooked at. However, I do know that I would say maybe 40% of this population is cisgender female, and cisgender female with children. A lot of them have children, which is also kind of an interesting thing. So with the trans house that we just opened a house for lesbian queer women, and in that house there are 7 children under 5 years old, and it's like, oh, why? I never thought we'd be dealing with that. But it's really great that the women are starting to feel overpowered, because it's like the men and the Ugandans are very, very loud and vocal compared to some of the other groups. And so a lot of things have been skewed towards men and towards Ugandans. And so if you're, a lesbian from Burundi, you feel very kind of on the edge, but we just kind of elected a new advisory board of people that are Kenyan and Ugandan, and that's a big push, is to try to get more women and more different country of origins as to be, because we want to hear their voices. Thank you all so much. This has been really, really great. Thanks.